Greetings, everybody. I'm here today with Brett Walter, the General Counsel of Ahab. Really delighted to get to visit with him. This conversation will be a wide-ranging variety from his upbringing in the northwestern part of the United States, which is beautiful country, and where I actually happen to find myself, all the way to tracing his legal career to Saudi Arabia and some of the interesting things that he's dealt with since being in Saudi Arabia since 2009. So, Brett, welcome. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me and us.
Sure.
Yeah, as Kelly probably told you, these conversations are really to help um, people who might be thinking of their careers understand a little bit of different paths, and you've certainly got an interesting one. Picking up lessons learned on how to be a better leader, which we've never met before today, but from Barry Cosgrave, my partner and dear friend, I hear you're a great example of that. So we haven't prepared. This is impromptu, and I think it's going to be a great conversation. So let me start, Brett, with asking you a little bit about where you grew up and your path to the University of Wyoming.
Sure. I was born in Laramie, Wyoming, which is the third biggest city in Wyoming, and with a population of 30 some thousand people. Um, my parents worked at the university, the one university in the state. So that's where I was born. I grew up, and it's funny. I mean, a lot of my classmates from Laramie don't live in Laramie anymore because just a small place. And if you don't work at the university, you don't live in Laramie for most of us. But a lot of us had, when we're in high school, we have big plans to. First, the big plan is to play Major League Baseball or in the NBA, and then you get real, and your plan is to go anywhere but there. And then eventually, we all went to the University of Wyoming because in-state tuition semester. I mean, I loved it. Met some great people, and it was my home school, so I was really proud Wyoming Cowboy fan, and I still am. We don't win much, but when we do, it's great. Makes it even better. And that's how I did it. I mean, my parents were there. I have a twin brother, and the two of us lived on campus, and it was great. It was a good place to grow up and a great place to go to school. It broadened my mind. And my parents, when I was growing up, my parents were sort of academic, and their mentality was to, be smart, study, but they weren't. I mean, I was more interested in playing baseball and basketball until I was 18 years old, and they were, just be serious about what you're doing and do a good job and live your life. Your whole goal is not to just become employable. So that was one thing that they were good about, was letting me do things and explore and learn things. And when I got to school, I was very interested, and I was a good college student. I took a lot of different classes and enjoyed it. So yeah,
Yeah,
that was my Wyoming experience.
yeah. As we were talking about before we kind of started, I'm sitting in Park City, Utah, which is not far away from your hometown. In fact, I frequent it once a year. I get to Wyoming. I don't get to Laramie every year, although I've been to Laramie. I was in Laramie last
Yeah,
summer. Um, and it's some of the greatest country in the world. I tell
it
people,
is.
travel around the world, and I'm sure you do the same thing. Uh, they say, well, I'm coming to the United States, and I want to go to New York and Miami and LA and Las Vegas, and I
Yeah.
always go to the American West. And my dad was the largest private collector of Teddy Roosevelt books and paraphernalia, and actually, we're going to get into your master's degree, but he was a banker starting from the age of 20, And he picked this collection up when I went to Dartmouth. He would come to see me, and it's a, New England has a lot of book collectors, so he accumulated all this stuff. And one of the keys to his collection, which he's now given to SMU, he passed away, is all of the Reuters photos from Teddy Roosevelt's visits out to the West, which led to the creation of Yellowstone, among other great national parks, which I think is the jewel of the American crown, as does Ken Burns.
Yeah.
So I think you're very fortunate to have grown up. I've gotten here as fast as I could 7 years ago, but it's fantastic. Tell me, as you look back on a little bit of a calmer existence than you've certainly had since law school forward, what are some things that you think about that you picked up on growing up in the country, growing up around Yellowstone National Park, that maybe have helped you as you've progressed in your career?
The one thing about people that I grew up with in Wyoming is, for a fairly rural state, there is a pretty open-minded mentality of people, in that, there's kind of an emphasis on being friendly, and people aren't anxious and angry or uncomfortable interacting with other people. And so, for example, even though it's a rural place, I would imagine that something like gay marriage is not something that a lot of people in Wyoming, when I was growing up, thought much about, but they also didn't have a strong aversion to anything like that. It was just more, it was kind of, live and let live. There was a real attitude of that, and it kind of a little bit of libertarian spirit. But I grew up in a kind of a, academic household, so, we're sort of politically liberal. But I never, the whole time growing up, I never, had any kind of sense of that. So I think in Wyoming, I think there was, when I was growing up, I don't know if it's the same still. I mean, my parents are there, but I don't live there. But it was an open-minded place, and learned to, just kind of do what they were doing, and be civil to each other and human to each other. And that was one thing I think I've taken away. I mean, it's one of my best assets, I think.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, and I've heard that about you. One of the reasons why I was so interested in having this conversation, as a Texan, I think Texans aspire to that mentality. I think it's you mentioned your mascot for your college is a cowboy. I'm of course a Dallas guy, so I'm a Cowboys fan, but Dallas Cowboys. But it's a cowboy mentality. It's not a traditional. I think people put the United States in North and South, and they kind of forget there's some parts of the world that don't really fall into that category. Not that the stereotypes work in those places either. What, out of curiosity, what were your parents' professors? What were their specialties?
My dad was a political science professor. He was from Washington State, from a little tiny town in Washington State, and so he's a political science professor, but for the last probably 25 years, he was at Wyoming. He was the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, which is the biggest college on campus. So he was a pretty big figure on campus, and my dad was very easygoing and very, very straightforward. And he was totally dedicated to the university and to professors and learning and teaching and students. And I mean, he was really, really into it. My mom is from Wyoming, and she was she was one of his students when he started as a professor, and then she raised us, and then she had a number of jobs, most of them at the university, either working with fund donors. She helped edit a Women in Politics journal for a number of years, and she's my brothers and I think she volunteers a little bit, sort of at maybe at the expense of her health and her time. So she's very active around town. And they've always been there since 1970, 71, and I don't think they're leaving.
Sound like wonderful people. You sound proud, and
Yeah.
you should be. What a
Yeah.
great upbringing. So you went to the University of Wyoming. Did you play sports in college?
No, I wish I could have, but I didn't.
That was
Not
me.
quite good enough.
Yeah, I was a high school baseball player, and even at Dartmouth, which is a different, Wyoming's a high caliber. I ended up doing debate. I tell people I was a good baseball player to do debate in college.
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting because you didn't straight path it to Duke Law. You went to Nebraska and you got a master's. Talk a little bit about that degree. What prompted you to get into that area, sociology?
That was sociology was what I ended up studying as an undergraduate. I didn't go into college looking for the most practical, skill set, I think. But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth it. Obviously, my dad being in his job and my mom, and their emphasis was broaden your mind, learn as much as you want, as much as you can, and there's nothing wrong with it, and you'll be fine. There was also a bit of an emphasis on just graduate school. So I met a girl. That's how I ended up in Nebraska. She was a student there. I'd met her one summer, and I was graduating before her. So she had about a year and a half left. So I went to Nebraska, and I wasn't just going to sit around. So I enrolled in the graduate school there, and I got a master's in sociology, studied social movements when I was there. That was something I was very interested in at the time, and did a master's thesis on social movements, and really enjoyed it, but it wasn't ever going to be my aim. I was literally just making sure I didn't waste my time totally while I was waiting. And then we both graduated, and we applied to a bunch of schools. She was a graduate student in environmental sciences, and so we both picked a place where we got into school together. And that's how we ended up in the South, North Carolina.
That's great. So you guys traveled to your law school at least after that.
Yeah.
And I want to touch on. I'm sure for a sociologist, even though you kind of are saying you fell into it a little bit, there are a lot of things that you pick up that you learned about at that deep of a level. My goodness, you're in Saudi Arabia, so one of the more unique areas I've ever traveled to in terms of it being I know you live in a Shia area, but it's a Sunni influenced population, and all the, reconciling the perceptions that the average American who hasn't traveled has about Islam and those kinds of things. So we'll touch on some of that a little bit later. But I'm fascinated to kind of hear you talk later about how you've observed the world that you live in now through the eyes of a sociologist. So you went to Duke. What a great place. Very different from where you grew up, obviously, but in a beautiful place of the world as well. Tell me a little bit about that experience and what prompted you to think, I want to be a lawyer.
At some point I did feel like I should think about what I was going to do with my life. And my dad, who was always an academic, had always said, if you don't really know what you want to do, there are certain degrees that you can get, and that there are a number of things you can do with it. You're not going to be railroaded into. For him, it's weird to say, he would say accounting is one. you can learn accounting and you can do any number of things with it. But it's a good skill to have, and being a lawyer was another one that he would mention. And so I knew, obviously, being in the liberal arts, a lot of the kids students who are in liberal arts do go to law school. So I decided that was what I'll do. It's not too far afield from what I was studying. I was interested in it, and I thought I could do that. And then it kind of bought me some time to think about, I could save the world or I could not save the world, but either way, I could have a law degree and in between there somewhere get a job if I needed to. I'd be flexible to move around, and really, I mean, that is one thing that's definitely come true for me. And when I used to interview, when I worked at a law firm, I used to often tell, focus less on spending a lot of money on a law degree. Like if you're not going to Harvard or one of the top few schools, don't leave New Orleans to go to some other school that's going to charge you a whole bunch of money, that's in a different market, but it's not a measurably different school than you might be able to go to at home. Go to school there, get a degree. Don't go $100,000, $200,000 in debt for something. Just get your degree. It'll work out, and then you've got it. And then open your mind and think about what you want to do. But you'll have the degree, you'll have the skill, and it's worked out. And that's what kind of drove me to it. It wasn't a lot of foreplanning, and I didn't have a grand plan for what I was going to do with my degree. But it was more school, and it was more learning, and I liked it. I think law school is maybe a year too long. I think it could be a little more practical now that but at least in America. But it was a good 3 years, and I liked it, and it worked out.
Yeah, I think it's 3 years more for the torture that it has to put you through in years 1 and 2.
The torture and tuition, yeah.
Exactly, the torture and tuition. You're right. The business model has to work, and your
right.
dad probably had a perspective on that you learned or picked up along the way. And so I think you went right to DC. Do I remember that correctly? Where
Yes.
did you go? Right. Yeah. And what kind of practice did you end up with, and how did being a sociologist and studying what you had studied influence what firm you went to and what you practiced in?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that was really my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, she graduated a year before me. So she'd gotten a job with an engineer in Washington. So that's where we were going. After when I graduated, I was just going to move up there. So I went through the interview process, and I was a pretty decent law student. I was probably maybe charitably 60th percentile in my class. I'm not the very top, but got some really good grades and then some pretty average ones. But I remember, my first 2 years, I did the interview process for southern cities, Atlanta and Charlotte, because they were local to Duke and North Carolina. And I could get lots of interviews, but nobody really wanted to hire me because they saw me as, you're from Wyoming. They didn't think I was really going to commit to Greensboro. And so I sort of struggled with that. And I remember thinking, God, what the hell? But then when I interviewed up in DC, it was better because it's DC and there's people from all over the place. And I ended up interviewing with a number of firms, but Morrison and Foerster, which is a San Francisco firm, but they had a DC office, which I didn't know anything about. I hadn't even heard of Morrison and Foerster. But a couple of the people I interviewed with, I really liked them. I really, really liked them. And so that's where I ended up taking the job. And I went up there, and the partner that I was working with was a guy named Jack Corrado, who was just a classic, firm litigator, super good at his job, and really good at being a mentor, like an old school, law partner mentor of a young lawyer. And he was an IP litigator. And so that's what I did for years out of school. I'm not an engineer. I knew statistics, but I didn't know anything else about, intellectual property or patents or anything. But I did patent litigation cases. At that age, at that level, you're mostly doing discovery disputes and discovery, as a young associate. But I did that. So that's what I did right out of law school was I went into that. And again, for me, I looked at it as I knew I wouldn't end up doing IP litigation, but I didn't mind because I figured I was making myself useful. I learned how to do litigation. I learned how to get by in the firm and to succeed in a firm, because that's also an important skill, to know how to serve, the firm that you're working for. And it ultimately wasn't, the thing for me, but I got a lot out of it, and that's how I think the most important thing at that point was working with people I liked, and really wanted to learn from.
And what, you mentioned your mentor in a way that sounded like it wasn't just an observation at the time, but it's something you kind of go back to a little bit. What made him a good mentor?
He made it really clear that he expected me to be good at my job, really good at it, but he knew that I wasn't good at it. And so he, when you come into law school, you're useless almost, and so he knew he would give me assignments and say, here is what you're probably going to do, but here is what you should be doing. And your instinct, like, for example, maybe the most important thing I've learned is, are you looking for solutions or are you looking for problems? Because lawyers are really good at finding problems. And your job is to find problems, and you should identify problems. But the client doesn't want you to come to them and say, you got a problem here. They want you to come and say, here are some issues. Here's what we can do about it. And he taught me to don't come to me and say, sorry, you've got a problem here. He wanted me to come and say, we have some issues. Here's what I think we should do about it. So he taught me to try to find a way. Your job is to find a way, which means, not just poking holes. That's not your job, to just poke holes. So he was really good at that, and he was also a very intense guy, pretty intense lawyer. He was I will say there were times when he yelled and he got way over in a positive and negative way, but he was really human. He knew when he was doing it. He was always interested in me as a person and in my growth and giving me opportunities. And I really appreciated that.
Isn't that beautiful? I mean, we have these general counsel roundtables virtually that we would love to involve you on, because you have so much to share. But, talking about the context we find ourselves, I mean, someone may look at this video in 2 years and not necessarily appreciate you're sheltered in place during a pandemic with virus 19. And one of the participants, who's a really wise guy, is the general counsel of a pyrotechnics company. So it's, their company shoots off fireworks at big sporting events and July 4th parades, things like that. Well, that's not an active business right now. And he made the comment of being very self-aware with your anxiety level, especially as we deal with a different kind of anxiety that I think the great mentors have, right? They know how to check themselves. Doesn't mean they're perfect, just means they realize how to do back, and frankly, you teach people through failure as well as success. So before we get to the transition of what, I know it may take a couple steps to Saudi Arabia, is there a failure? Is there that one moment up to this point, not since, where you faced something and you failed, and that failure has stuck with you and instructs you to this day? Probably
Specific situations might be, I remember when a litigator only when I was at the firm, I got too worried about looking stupid. And so that's why going to court made me so nervous, because I was always worried that I was going to look like the idiot in the room. And this guy I was working for, Jack, he's the one that said to me, go to court. Like, look who's in court. You won't believe it. And the guys who do the best are the ones who don't care. They just don't care. And they're learning from their mistakes on the fly. And you know, there, a lot of them are not as smart as you, but they're experienced, and some of them aren't. And he basically just go and look. And he always he didn't see me as just a I guess. So he knew that, like, you should spend time doing that. And so one of the mistakes I think I made was being way overcautious and too deferential, because I think it's important to listen to your people who are more experienced, but thinking that everyone else has it figured out and you don't is a big failure that I think a lot of people have, especially in the legal profession, because I think in the current profession, as I see it, there's so much specialization, and there's so much there's such an emphasis on being perfect with every little comma in a document. And I'm not saying that's not important. It's just that in the real world, it doesn't really matter. You don't need to be perfect in every little thing. It's better to do something than to be right with every aspect of it. Just do something. Make a decision. I mean, the good, fiddling while Rome burns, all those, cliches work. And so I think I was overcautious, and I still fight that urge. I'm still overcautious, even though I'm more experienced than most of the people I work with out here, because I didn't develop early on this sense of, acting like I knew what I was doing before I knew it. And there is a certain amount of faking it till you make it in anything, but I think I was too cautious. And then another I think failure that I probably, one mistake I made, which I learned from, is when you make a mistake, just own up to it. The quickest way past the mistake is to own it. And because it's always the cover up that causes the problem. It's always you tell a little story or a fib or the truth a little bit, and then you have something else you have to claw out of. So the best thing, and in the end, everyone's been there. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows that people make mistakes. And so, I remember one time with a document production, I let some privileged documents go. When that was my one job, was to catch them, and I didn't. And so and I remember I just had to go in, and I thought long and hard about what should I do, and I just owned up to it, and it was uncomfortable, but it was, of course, it was all fine in the end.
It is amazing.
Happens.
It happens. I mean, I'm a business fraud litigator, so of course we're going to get into in a little bit the very famous case that your company, which is one of the great companies in the Middle East, I think started in 1940, was involved with, and you do see in these business fraud cases, you see examples where if just somebody would deal with it at the outset, it minimizes the damage. I remember we had a little roofing case, and we sued Arthur Andersen along with the main other third parties, and this was in the middle of the Enron scandal, and I went to Chicago to try to settle the case because Arthur Andersen's in the crosshairs on Enron, and we didn't know what was going to happen. In fact, the trial's going on in Houston, and on the Friday before, I call the opposing counsel. I say, "Hey, I'm gonna go to Chicago. Who the hell am I meeting with?" And he said, "Well, they're not going to pay for me to go, so you're going to meet with Nancy Temple." And I said, "Well, isn't Nancy Temple the lawyer? Sent the email basically kind of suggesting folks tidy up their documents." And he said, yeah, that's the one. Saturday, you may remember, basically Arthur Andersen gets the death penalty. And I walk into the worldwide headquarters of Arthur Andersen in Chicago on Monday. Everybody thinks I'm somebody important. We've really just got a business fraud case. And, I just was so impressed with Nancy Temple because while she'd made an error, she sat with us. She was very authentic about her thoughts on it. And, I said to myself, this is a person who will not let her life be defined by one mistake. And I think it's a great lesson for people. Thank you for being vulnerable enough to share that. I think, you've probably got your dad, the dean, on one shoulder who has to deal with practical issues with fraternities and social life and things like that. And you've got your dad, the academic, who probably taught you, like I had, this we think we control everything phenomenon, which we learn very quickly we don't. So tell us how, you go from a pretty fancy U.S.-based law firm, and how do you get to Saudi Arabia? Tell us about that journey.
After a few years at Morrison & Foerster, I could sort of envision that I might spend the next 10 years doing discovery. And I, kind of thought, I luckily, I'm married to somebody who's encouraging in this respect, but I didn't want to do it. I was kind of complaining about it and decided to move on. And I had a couple of choices. I could go to I'm in DC, you go to the Department of Justice, maybe look for a job as a U.S. attorney. There's a lot of law jobs in Washington. And I ended up to check out this small litigation boutique that is in Washington called Lewis Bach. And I interviewed with them and ended up getting a job with them, and it's a really cool little place. They mostly do international fraud cases, and because they're not a big, multinational, they can end up doing work that a lot of the big multinational firms cannot do because of conflicts and reputation and whatever else. So they can do some cases. They can sue banks and things that others necessarily can't do. So I went to work for them, and after a few, and it was really good experience and great, and there's some amazing lawyers there. And in fact, I felt too dumb to work there most days. But that's another thing I've learned over time is don't be afraid to look stupid. Yeah, it's actually not a terrible thing. It just means you ask more. They ended up with a client in Saudi Arabia, which is the firm Ahab that I work for now. And so I was the first person for this big engagement that we'd gotten on the ground on this big thing. And I flew in, and it was a big fraud case that was just kind of unwinding, and there was just chaos, and we're locking down buildings and hiring people as fast as we can to come in and investigate. And so I started working there and worked primarily on that for, I was an associate at the time, then I became a partner, and then after several years, 2009.
Yeah.
It was 2009 when it kicked off.
Not a crazy time at all, really.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's exactly right. I mean, this was definitely one of the dominoes to fall was this case, and but it wasn't just one case. I mean, it was such a big, huge collapse that it spawned 100 different pieces of litigation, and I was kind of helping manage it at the firm. And then a guy we were working with from Deloitte, who's a fraud investigator, forensic accountant, got hired as sort of a restructuring officer at the company, and he built his own team, and so that's when I went in-house with them in Saudi. So it wasn't like a light decision; it was a big decision. But I don't mean to make it seem like it was no big deal.
Yeah, no, it's we all just think about picking up and moving to Saudi Arabia every day. I mean, it's no, it's a
Yeah.
fascinating one, and it's you meet somebody and you kind of can project onto a person uh, that decision without knowing all the facts. But the way you've told this story really explains a lot of why you're adventurous and kind of who you are, which I think makes you such a person that people will learn from this interview. At least I hope they do. And so this was, I mean, what you're alluding to, the big case is called the Bernie Madoff case of the Middle East, right? It was the biggest fraud. In fact, the decision that was handed down a couple of years ago was 1,300 pages or something like that, dealing with all
Yeah.
of the various issues. And and I know it's a pending case. I know it's on appeal, and I know you will monitor and regulate how you comment on it. But I think it's really more important for the lessons learned. But so you get thrust into this new world. You're living in a suburb of Daman. Where do you live?
I live in actually we live in Bahrain, which is a little, island kingdom off the coast of Saudi Arabia. About a million, maybe 1.2 million people. About half of them are expats, most of them who drive over into Saudi and work. But it's actually a fairly moderate little country, and a very open place, relative to the surrounding areas. So it's a nice place to live, but I have to commute around, 15, 20 miles over a land bridge, a causeway into Saudi every day.
I've seen it. I've seen that land bridge. When I was in Daman, I
Yeah.
was seeing Aramco, and I remember looking at the weather that day, and it, of course, did not convert to Celsius. It was on my Fahrenheit, and it had 110 degrees, blowing sand. I'd never had that on my weather app
Yeah.
before. Um, but
I
I know
grew
it's
up in Wyoming where it's Yeah, I grew up in Wyoming where it's cold and windy, and then out here in the summer it's hot and windy. So, yeah,
yeah,
the
a
exact
different
opposite side
world.
of the coin.
And
Mm.
so the company Ahab's offices are in the suburb outside of Daman. Is that right?
In a city called Khobar, Al Khobar.
Or
Yeah,
got it.
so it's probably only famous for it's near Dhahran where Aramco is. It's just a sisters. All those cities are just right. It's like Minneapolis, St. Paul, or a place like that, and just all sister cities right next to each other, and twin cities. And it's where there was a big terrorist attack in
Yeah.
2004. But Ahab is the company is owned by a family, that's sort of a prominent family in that part of Saudi Arabia in the eastern province, which is oil country. And they were a kind of a trading family. They're not royalty. They made their money through supportive services to the oil industry, and then through partnering with other foreign partners, Pepsi Cola and other manufacturers who moved into Saudi in the middle of the 1900s, and that's how they made their name before everything went kind of sour in 2009.
So I mean, and it's fascinating. I mean, it's an 80-year-old company. It's got beautiful philosophy, tracing back to the founder, this reap what you sow, long view, cultural philosophy. So I suspect that was an attraction. But explain what led you, other than you're working in the middle of this very interesting set of cases. For a company, what attracts you to go in the middle of the Great Recession, to go to Saudi Arabia, live in a Bahrain, and work for this company?
I mean, the primary motivator, I think, was I liked my job. and I loved my firm and the people I worked with. But I wasn't sure that I wanted to wake up and be 60 years old and only have done that. It's just not who I am. And I, risk, and luckily I have a supportive family for that. I mean, they have the same mentality. And, we thought, what's really, I think the thing is about, working and doing enough things, you get confidence that you can, you can do things and you'll be okay. You should live your life a bit like somebody who does a lot of trades, where you're going to win some and lose some. And that's kind of how I was trying to be. I didn't want to just do one job forever. So when this opportunity came up, we thought, let's do it. Let's move abroad. Let's try it out. I mean, we'll be fine. And so, and it was the best. It really was the best thing I've done. I mean, I've just loved every minute of it. I've loved getting on a different path, and I've had so many experiences from it that I never would. And I think that's the advice I would give people is don't be on a single path. Just definitely don't be afraid to change course. You're never really too old for it. Maybe when you're 90, you're too old for it. But I'm in my 40s. I fundamentally don't believe that anyone's too old to change paths. I mean, you aren't, and it can work out. You just have to have the kind of confidence and feeling that it will, and then make it work. But that was kind of what I felt about it, and so we just jumped and did it. And the situation's very interesting too. So I think that is a big part of it. I mean, the family-owned business, the story is, obviously, contested, and it's there's a lot of litigation, like you said. But I mean, there's no denying that this family, one of the patriarchs or one of the old founders' daughters, married a guy who they put him in charge of a branch of the company, which it's a general partnership, unfortunately, and this was a branch business, so it was just like a department in the company. And he ran a massive Ponzi scheme out of it, borrowing money in the company's name, some of it authorized, most of it not authorized, and a huge part of the money he just siphoned away for his own interests. And then the credit crunch happened, it all collapsed, and he walked away and left the company holding the liabilities. And therefore, that in fact, in real dollars, it's bigger than Madoff. I mean, because Madoff was a lot of fake money, fake profits. This is real money, and trillions of dollars went through bank accounts in New York. And at the end of the day, there's between 6 and 9 liabilities owed to around 100 banks, and now they're all hedge funds who've bought in and whatnot. So it's really complicated. It's very interesting. And I'm definitely not a specialist anymore because of all the different things that we have to do here.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it's and what it appears. I mean, I haven't read all 1,300 pages of the Cayman Islands decision, but it appears that Man Al-Sinea, did I say that right? He was
he's the guy.
Yeah, and he lived quite a lavish lifestyle around this with the money that he accumulated. I mean, I think I read he had an A380 as a private plane, that kind of a thing.
He was, on the Forbes list, I think in the top 60 or 50 richest people in the world, and he was like a king, literally, and didn't have any real business at all. The whole business was borrowing money from one bank, paying that bank, keeping a little bit of it for yourself, borrowing money from a different bank, all unsecured. Well, not all of it, but 95% of it's unsecured. Borrowing. No one's really doing any due diligence. I mean, it was the, heyday of lending and borrowing, and he built himself a huge empire off of this kind of practice. I mean, really, the guy, there was no real business out of it. And so, and then he he managed to do that, and because he's in Saudi Arabia, he was exploiting the system at the time, and I think Saudi Arabia has made huge leaps to their credit, but at the time there's not enough transparency. There's local parties over foreign traders and investors, and so his view was that he's a Saudi, and the foreign banks who think he owes them money, he'll just close the door, and the Saudis won't let the foreigners in to take it, to get it back from him. Turns out he was wrong. It's been a long process, but I think it's pretty clear that the Saudis are letting the foreign banks in to try to recover what they can.
And so you come into an organization that culturally is different than what a U.S. company, a privately held U.S. company would be, with the checks, and I think I read on the website for Ahab, very admirable quality, very much of a handshake culture, a trust.
Very.
They cultivated their wealth by helping the government in difficult times and helping people during difficult times. So you come in, you see all this stuff that was, exposure that was created because there weren't protocols, it appears.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what you've done during the course of your tenure there, and what challenges did you face from the family and the influential decision makers in, hey, that's not our culture, and you're saying, yeah, but it's led to a lot of liability, and we need to wrestle this to the ground. What are your observations on that?
It's we might need a few more hours, but you're right. This company never had a legal function, never had a legal department, lawyers, and by and large, it was sort of you had different people who were called finance managers who just handled everything, and they didn't really think too much about legalities of any of this stuff. And to the family's credit, they hired us. They hired a team of people who are outsiders, we came in, and we've tried to change the whole way they do everything, including, I guess as one example, without going on too long, is disclosure. The mentality in this part of the world for litigation and business is you reveal what you need to reveal, but you sure do not show your dirty laundry ever. And there's no way for anyone to compel you to do anything else. And for us to come in, and essentially my main job as the general counsel of this company is one, to improve governance, and two, to try to settle the liabilities. And to do a settlement with 100 different banks, and majority of them are European, Western banks, you have to be kind of open. If you're going to do a big settlement, you have to give asset information and explain things about your business that normally they wouldn't. And there have been some growing pains with that. Coming from America, my view is you have to give it all, and then you deal with the warrants. Out here, it's just not the same mentality. So we've had to deal with that, and they do mostly what we tell them to do to try to solve the problem. But but I'll go to like a department in the company and say, I need all the title deeds for the properties, and the person who works there, what's helpful to the company, but I'm not going to give everything because I don't want to give the stuff that might not be helpful to the company. So then I may have to go to a board member and say, look, so-and-so, I don't think he's given me everything. And then we have to have a meeting, and then, this goes several times, and eventually you get what you need. So, and it's not, he's not trying to be a crook. He's just doing what he's learned to do, and the way that things happen. So it's, every day is like that. And the executive team that I work with, who are mostly Deloitte guys, ex-Deloitte guys, we always say, God, why is everything so difficult? Because it is. It's just everything's difficult. And when we're in litigation or when we're talking to lawyers from London or mostly Europe, but sometimes American lawyers, to them, it should be easy to do some of these things. Just get the company board book, or just get the file, and it's like you don't realize, like, it's not how it works here. It's just not how it works in this part of the world. And I think it's getting better. I think companies are getting better, but we're talking about something that went back to the 80s when that's not how it worked. So for being flexible and being willing to kind of put up with that is important if you're going to do this kind of a job, because it's just not it's almost annoys me when someone comes in and asks, like, oh, surely you have a formal resolution for that. I try to calm down and just say, let me check for you.
Yeah.
So
that's a great segue, because you're right. I'm going to ask you to commit on camera to another session, because there are so many areas I want to go into with you that we're not going to get to them all. So I'm going to ask you to you're very humble. It's very clear you're modest. You have a lot of humility. But remember, I asked you to talk about your failures. So now I'm going to ask you to think back and say, what is, whether it was your sociological perspective, your upbringing in, a much more rural place than many people grow up in, what's that thing that has allowed you to cultivate such immense respect in an organization that, let's face it, I mean, you got dropped into an organization to be their general counsel, I assume their first ever general counsel, at a time when they're going through absolute chaos. It's the worst time in the family's history. So what skill did you bring to this that allowed you to succeed?
I think,
I knew you'd have a hard time with this one.
I'm good at relating to people. It's easy for me to accept cultural differences and quickly pick up on it, and then apply what I can do as much as I can to the situation. I think I'm really good at that, and I think that is why this isn't a job that everybody could do. I'm very confident. I think I do a great job. I think I'm completely equipped to do what I do, and yet sometimes I think, what do I do? What do I know? I meet lawyers at these firms who are, like our lawyer at K&L Gates. He's so good at doing what he does, and I couldn't do it if I tried. I just couldn't. And I sometimes wonder what the hell. So I think but I do think at the same time it's I think I'm willing to be uncomfortable, and to take risk, and that is really is the thing that I've grown accustomed to, is the discomfort of certain situations. And I feel like that's where I'm at my best, is being uncomfortable in a situation and figuring it out. I mean, I'm in a job where literally my success will, at working out the company's debts, and I will no longer have a job once we're done. And it's the kind of thing that I think a lot of people wouldn't look at and relish, but I actually I've grown accustomed to it, and I like that kind of element of my job. So it's that sense of being able to deal with that and then do what I do, because I'm not the greatest technical specialist really in anything, and I'm not afraid to say it. But I also am capable of working in this environment and working out the situation and working out the problems with what I know and what I can learn, because I know that's one of our obligations as a lawyer, is to represent your client and to make sure that you know what you need to know as best as possible.
Yeah, it's I have a really good client and friend who actually went to Duke undergrad, and he's a very successful Dallas businessman, and he recommended a book to me, and I knew it would be heady. It was about quantum physics by this guy Sean Carroll called The Big Picture, and it was I'm like your dad. I was a government major at Dartmouth, so I'm not a science person at all. But essentially, the book boils down in its essence to the only way that we actually pass on genetic growth is through stress and challenge. And to me, your story, and I go back to the mentor you had at MoFo, telling you to, kind of look in the courtroom and look around. The fact that you've kind of challenged yourself. I mean, not many lawyers have a master in sociology. That's just not normal. The fact that you've gone from Laramie to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and had to immerse in completely different cultures, it really sounds like you subscribe to that philosophy of, you're just making yourself better by exposing yourself to really super challenging situations. And through that, you're getting this perspective and this wisdom that goes way farther than what's in the legal books or in the board books or in the documents. And I can't tell you how fascinating this has been. I hope we can do a part 2. I really do. I think there's a lot here that I'd like to pick up on. Yeah. And I hope actually, whether it's me getting over to see you when this pandemic ends, because we haven't even gotten into some of that stuff, because you're living in a very place. I mean, we could go another hour easy, but we can't. Yeah. You've got to sleep. But hopefully, maybe when you get back to Wyoming, I'll be in Park City and I'll pop up to see you. But whatever it is, I've got to say thank you for sharing this. This is you've had such a fascinating journey. There's so much you have that I think people will really enjoy hearing, and I think they'll be begging for a part 2. So maybe we schedule that in the coming weeks.
Sure, no problem. I'm home.
Exactly. We're both home, It's exactly. Without disrupting the film, I'd turn it around and let you see at least the southern version of the mountains that you grew up hanging out in.
Oh my God.
Yeah. My daughter's actually in a school right now at the base of the Sawtooth, so in Idaho.
Wow.
Yeah. So Brett, thank you. I'm not going to take up any more of your time, and I wouldn't even know if I got into another topic, we'd be going another half hour. So I very much look forward to meeting you and your family. And I can't thank Barry enough for suggesting this idea, and I hope it's the first of many encounters with you.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate Barry for recommending it.
Excellent. Well, I will let you get to, family obligations and sleep and things like that. And
thank you very much.
Yeah. Take care.
Talk soon. All right.